On this week's edition of New York Now, Republicans rally around President Donald Trump and rail against Governor Andrew Cuomo.
Our president embodies what it means to be New York tough.
We'll have analysis on that and more with Karen DeWitt from New York State Public Radio and Joe Spector from the USA Today Network. Later, Karen speaks with Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul about the impending child care crisis in New York as parents head back to work. And Kyle Belakapitsky from the New York State PTA answers the question on everyone's mind. Is New York ready to reopen schools? That's all coming up. I'm Dan Clark, and this is New York Now.
Today, the Senate majority will pass legislation.
We will pass a law prohibiting it, and we will take them to court challenging it.
Taking another stand for New York and sending a message to the nation.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. Republicans rallied across the country this week to support President Donald Trump in his re-election bid. And that included Republicans from right here in New York, a state that Trump called home until he changed his residence to Florida last year. Nick Langworthy, the head of New York's Republican Party, was at the RNC to award the state's delegates to Trump. And he wasted no time in going after Governor Andrew Cuomo. On the first night of the convention, each state's delegation had a minute or so to speak about why they were supporting the president's re-election bid. And Langworthy used part of the time to criticize Cuomo's speech last week at the DNC. You'll remember that Cuomo talked all about how the federal government failed in its response to the coronavirus. Here's Langworthy at the RNC.
Our president embodies what it means to be New York tough. And when New York was facing some of its darkest hours a few months ago, our president stepped up and delivered for the people of the state of New York. Even our governor, Andrew Cuomo, congratulated him and thanked him for that tremendous support. And it was a terrible shame last week when that same governor went to his party's convention and lied about our president's leadership in this crisis.
That is very different from what Cuomo said this week. During a briefing with reporters on Long Island, Cuomo said the federal government essentially caused the COVID crisis in New York.
The COVID problem in New York was a direct result of the negligence of the federal government. If this was a private situation, the state could sue the federal government for negligence, gross negligence. The federal government is responsible for public health and international monitoring of public health. CDC, Centers for Disease Control, NIH, Department of Homeland Security, their job is to track global pandemics.
There is a lot to unpack from that, and with me in studio this week is Karen DeWitt from New York State Public Radio and Joe Spector from the USA Today Network. Joe, Karen, thanks so much for being here.
Glad to be here and in person.
I know, it's great.
Yes.
So we had the RNC this week. I watched a lot of it. I don't know how much you guys watched, but what surprised me about the RNC, I think, was the fact that you had Elise Stefanik here, you had Lee Zeldin speaking along with Nick Langworthy, and neither of them went after the governor. And that surprised me because I figured them being from New York, they'd take that opportunity to go against somebody who is an enemy of the president and really galvanize the base.
Right, well that's the thing though, you know, when you're on the national stage for Elise Stefanik and Lee Zeldin, you're not there to talk about New York politics. You're there to talk about national politics. You're there to further the candidacy of the president. And in this case, President Trump, who you saw them both talk very, glowingly about the need to have him in a second term, knocking Democrats for being critical of him. You can go down the list of those issues. But nonetheless, you saw Nick Langworthy, though. His role is different, right? He's the state GOP chairman, so he has to talk about New York politics to some extent, and also obviously promote the president as well. But for them, their focus is national politics and also getting their name out as they both seek re-election.
Yeah, I agree. The RNC, it's the Donald Trump show. It's about Donald Trump furthering his narrative. And maybe Governor Andrew Cuomo, as much as they don't like him, isn't quite important enough to focus on him in that kind of way. Elise Stefanik is representing a demographic that I think the Republicans would like to win over, which is young women. She's in a unique position, certainly in New York State. She represents the North Country, a Republican stronghold. She's relatively young, in her 30s. 4 years ago, when she ran for re-election, she wouldn't even mention Trump's name. And now
Right.
she's very allied with him. She became a GOP star during Trump's impeachment trial, and she's really formed a bond with him. And now she's staking her future on Donald Trump by appearing at this convention.
Right, and good points. Nick Langworthy, I think you're right, Joe, and you're right, Karen, that Nick's role is really going to be to push these state races where we see competition in the state Senate to turn it red again, competition in specific assembly races, specific congressional races. But just on that note, another thing that surprised me is that we didn't have those congressional candidates from New York in really competitive districts like the 22nd and the 19th district in kind of very big district is the 19th and the 22nd, so I won't tell our viewers where they are, but they're in upstate New York.
Oh, yes, they go on and on and on.
19th is Hudson Valley,
on
22nd is Central New York. But yeah,
Right.
to your point, Dan, you know, those are both districts where Republicans held those seats and lost them 2 years ago. Now they're held by Democrats, Anthony Brindisi and Antonio Delgado. So, you know, the issue is, do you put those Republican candidates in a position where they are in a battleground race? Does it help them to be there at the RNC, or does it hurt them? You know, it's so different. Karen and I, Dan, we've all gone to these conventions over the years, and there's really opportunities for those candidates who aren't well known. Maybe they don't get on the convention stage, but they're able to mingle with people from all around the country, get their name out, perhaps raise money, hold fundraisers. You're not having that this
No,
year.
you're right. That's a big loss for those candidates, I think. And I was also thinking about back in 2016 when we were actually at the convention. There was a New York congressperson who was very prominent at the time, and that was Representative Chris Collins,
Right.
who was one of the first in Congress to support President Donald Trump. He, of course, fell in hard times, shall we say. He got convicted of federal insider trading charges and is no longer a congressman. But that is also a seat that is open right now. Though they did have a special election and Chris Jacobs is in it, it's still considered pretty much an open seat, although that again is a strong Republican district. So there are some Republican areas in New York where they'll probably have success. But I think what Langworthy and others are trying to further is maybe winning over some more voters in New York.
Right, I think we'll have to see how it works down ballot from trickling down to these really competitive state Senate races, because as you and I and everybody here watching the show knows, if the Republicans take the state Senate, they have a significant foothold of power in the state legislature that they just don't have right now.
Yeah.
And speaking of power, the governor this week really went on a tirade against the CDC and some new guidelines about testing, and I'm kind of confused about it. So I hope that either of you know a little bit more about this. The CDC has since kind of amended those guidelines and said you may get tested, not that you don't really have to.
Yeah, they changed the language a little bit, and they kind of say things like, well, not everybody needs a test, not necessarily. Only if you've been closer than 6 feet for more than 15 minutes with someone who was found to be COVID positive. And it used to say, if you even suspect that might have happened, you better go get a test because somebody can be asymptomatic and be sharing the virus. So the end result, if people follow this, will be fewer tests. And President Donald Trump has said a number of times he wants fewer tests. So Governor Cuomo was quick to pick up on that and say, I think this is all political and it's not about health and it's not about science.
Yeah, the other piece of that is quarantine. The CDC said, we're not necessarily saying you have to quarantine, but they did defer to the states when it comes to quarantining. And New York has a very aggressive one. 33, 34 states, depending on the week, have to quarantine for 14 days when they visit. They're testing people at the border. They have roadblocks up, border, checkpoints. So, but Governor Cuomo said, no, we're still going to move forward with our quarantine. It was critical of any efforts to scale that back.
Also, the fact that this happened right before the RNC started to meet has made a lot of people suspicious. And also, on a side note, that apparently Dr. Anthony Fauci was under general anesthesia when they made these changes. He was having surgery for his vocal cords.
Yeah, Cuomo would be quipped today of something that if he'd have to be under general anesthesia to agree to these CDC guidelines. That was his line.
It's interesting to me because the governor seems to be hot and cold with the CDC. I remember when he was defending the nursing homes.
Oh yeah, then it's the CDC guidelines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and
well-
now he's saying, well, we're not going to follow the CDC. It's all political. So really
Well, luckily the
interesting.
CDC keeps changing their guidelines, so you can be with them one day and against them the next, I suppose.
Right, right. So next in our show is an interview that you have, Karen, with Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul. You spoke to her about childcare, which is this perennial issue, pandemic or not. people have problems with childcare, and it especially affects low-income people. Give me some takeaways from that interview.
Yeah, she's really taken on this issue, and I guess the biggest takeaway I had is, why are we still talking about this? And I think you'll hear in the interview that she's pretty exasperated about it as well.
And she's had some personal experiences with a crisis in childcare in her own life from when she was younger, just starting her career. And
That's right, like many women.
yeah, exactly. Let's take a look at that interview.
Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, thanks for joining us once again.
Karen, thanks for having me back on your show.
Even if it is remotely, but I guess we're used to that these days. So one of the issues you've been talking about a lot in recent weeks is childcare, or the lack of childcare, and how the pandemic has made it worse. What are some of your main concerns about that?
Well, Karen, we had a crisis way before the pandemic. I mean, this is every woman who has struggled to try and get someone to watch their children so they can go to work has faced this specter of too few slots, too expensive, not accessible, not affordable. But then you bring a pandemic into it. I mean, this is just a collision course that is just incomprehensible how families are struggling. Think about the early days. We had to allow the frontline workers, the essential workers, to be able to leave the security of their homes. When all of us are hunkering down, they had to go into the hospitals. Healthcare workers, 77% of healthcare workers are women. Who's watching their kids? Then we have the people working in the grocery stores. 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. Who's watching their kids? So since March, I mean, this has really come to a head. And now compound all this with the fact that children may not be occupied in school for your school-age children from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. the way they would have in the past. So now what do? So Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and I traveled the state. We went to 6 different cities. We had forums on this, pointing to the fact that the federal government has to help us solve this crisis. They gave some initial money back in March, wasn't enough. And as part of the package we're looking for from Mitch McConnell to do the right thing for all states, not just blue states, this affects the red states, and for us to get the economy going again. There will be no full recovery of our economy unless women are able to get back to jobs and that their children are cared for. And the federal government has a major role to play in that.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot in there you just said to unpack. One of the things I noted when you were traveling with Senator Gillibrand, she said that up to 50% of child care centers in the state might close and close permanently. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of obstacles to providing safe child care during COVID. I mean, for one thing, small children, toddlers, they can't really wear masks and they don't social distance. So there's a lot of concerns from the child care providers, right?
If this was a provider who took children into their home all the way to a larger one, we had to scale back the number of children. So if you're trying to earn an income as a child care provider and all of a sudden 50%, or you're down to 25% or less, less than 50% of what you would have had, first of all, the economics don't work out. But also the concern about your own children. You may be someone watching other people's kids in your home, and your own children are exposed now to that outside world during a pandemic. So it's frightening for people. And so we are losing slots. At one time, we were down to having 1 slot for every 4 children in need. Now it's about 1 in 7. I mean, this is just cataclysmic. And I've spoken to so many CEOs of major companies, from Buffalo to Brooklyn, asking them, what is your biggest concern about recharging this economy? How we can supercharge it and come back and really just go on all cylinders? And they said their biggest obstacle, and this surprised the heck out of me, they all said childcare, because they know that they now finally have more women in the workplace, and those women cannot leave the children home alone, and there's nobody to watch them. And you can't bring in your mother or father like you might have been able to rely on that. And so employers have to have flexibility, stagger hours, help find childcare. I've said to some of the larger employers, can you take your cafeteria space, convert it into a childcare center, and you hire people to come in and watch the kids who otherwise would be in school, set up little laptops and make sure someone's making sure they're getting their work done. There's a lot of ways that employers can help solve this problem in addition to the government providing resources.
But as you mentioned, the child care issue goes beyond the pandemic. Now, you and I have been in politics and journalism a little while. It seems like I have been covering or talking about this issue for decades, and it never gets resolved. Do you find that at all frustrating?
Oh, yeah. I had children 32 years ago, working as a young staffer on Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's staff. I was an attorney. I loved my job, but the hours were crazy. I mean, we would work morning till night, and sometimes we literally pulled all-nighters when they were in session. You have a child, nobody to watch the kids. I didn't have parents. I didn't have family. I didn't have a support system. I was from New York. I'm down in Washington. And I literally had to walk away from that. And I tried to start a little business at home, a little consulting business with a second baby at home. And I had a tiny house next to my washing machine and dryer. I set up a little desk, put a couple toys under it, and that was my office. And you could hear my kids. I'd be on the phone with a client, and I'd say, oh, that child care center down the hall is too noisy today. It's like, those are my kids under my desk. So it was tough. And it's so frustrating to me that 30 years later, when my children are child rearing age, that we haven't figured this out yet. I mean, that is absolutely pathetic. And I am sick and tired of this being a reason why women do not live up to their full economic potential, their full earning potential for their families, which their families need, but also their own self-fulfillment to become a partner in a law firm because you can put in the hours, become a CEO because you've been able to have the child care angle figured out, as well as just people trying to get out there and earn a living wage. And so it's every end of the socioeconomic scale, women are hit the hardest once again.
Well, speaking of women's issues this year, as you well know, is the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote, at least white women. For women of color, it's been more of a struggle. I thought we'd be doing something really fun in Seneca Falls this summer, a big celebration, and obviously that's not going to happen because of the pandemic. I'm wondering, do you have concerns about not just women, but everyone's right to vote this fall, with all we've been hearing about the post office slowing down, mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, sometimes getting thrown out on technicalities? I mean, how are you feeling? Are you feeling optimistic about the vote this November, or do you have worries?
No, this is exasperating. I mean, this is a time we should be celebrating access to the ballot box that was denied women and people of color for the early part of our history. We finally remedy it with respect to, as you said, white women in 100 years ago. Women of color were not guaranteed that right until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, something that historians didn't quite acknowledge properly, and we're getting there. We're trying to fix that narrative. But that being said, 2020, we should not be talking about whether or not there's going to be any compromising of our right to vote. I mean, that is sacred. That's about as American as it gets, to be able to exercise that right to vote without any fear of interference. But for the way the president is undermining and creating a subterfuge that there's going to be fraud and scandal and people are going to steal the election, he is intentionally tarnishing that and undermining the post office. My God. If there's not an institution that we all understand has been there since before we had a constitution, I mean, this is part of America. Think about the Pony Express. I mean, we rely on them. And even now in those rural states and rural parts of our own state, people rely on the mail to give them their medicines. They come in the mail now, so people don't have to go out to the pharmacy during a pandemic. I think there's going to be a whole lot of people who are buying that narrative that Donald Trump is already putting out there, that this election is rigged or somehow undermined by fraud, and we cannot let that happen. I mean, we have to be the line of defense against that happening and accept the outcome, because we have to fight against any interference in the ability to vote by mail.
Well, that's a topic for a whole other interview, I think. We'll have to leave it there. Fingers crossed that everything works out well this fall. Thanks very much for joining us, Lieutenant Governor.
Great to see you again, Karen. Take care. Bye-bye. Come to Seneca Falls.
I will.
The state's child care crisis is expected to get worse when students head back to school in just a few weeks. But that's just one of several concerns that parents have about sending their kids back to class. There's still a lot of questions to sort out, like how will school districts handle testing for the virus? And how many cases would it take for a district to close down? Kyle Bell-Kapitsky has heard a lot of those concerns. She's the executive director of the New York State PTA. We spoke this week. Kyle, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having us on. We're really excited to talk about the future of reopening of our schools.
Me too, and I think it's on everybody's mind. And I don't think that I'm alone in saying that I'm kind of worried about kids going back to school.
I know, it's not It's on all parents' mind right now, all parents and families.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you have these kids going back to what is by definition a congregate place. Are we ready for students to head back? It's only going to be a few days from now.
I will tell you the one great thing that is very unique about New York State and the guidance that we have from both the Department of Health and the State Education Department is that each district's plan is very tailored to their own needs. So we have 760 some school districts across New York State. Not one plan is the same. Some school districts we know are starting back remote for a few weeks. Some are starting back remote for a few months, which creates some issues with parents having to go back to work and childcare and remote learning, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have some districts like mine, for instance, we're going back Monday through Friday like normal. So it's going to be very interesting. Lots of conversations, I think, around the dining room table right now amongst educators and families and what this is going to look like.
So you were on the Governor's Advisory Council for Reimagining Education, which means that you helped develop the reopening guidelines. Are we doing this right? I think that's the question on everybody's minds is, it's going to vary by district, obviously, but we have this overarching theme of wearing face coverings and social distancing and protecting students and teachers. Is there, I guess the question is, are we doing this right? Is there any way to improve it going forward?
I guess there's no easy answer. I think the best answer we have is that I fully believe with all of my soul, 100%, that each and every school district is going to do the best that they can to keep both their educators and children safe. There are negatives. We saw, when we had to go remote immediately, we saw huge equity gaps. We saw huge access gaps. We saw a rise of mental health issues among students and both faculty and ourselves as community members, as we were all kind of sequestered in our homes. It's time to go back to school. Kids are ready, kids are excited. I can tell you my son is very excited, and they are way more adaptable than us. I complain if I wear a mask for 5 minutes. Jackson can be in a mask for 2 hours with his friends and it doesn't bother him. I do think there's going to be continuing concerns and conversations about how we can increase safety and security, how we can increase health protections for both faculty and staff and educators that are in school buildings and both students. That's going to be ongoing.
You mentioned equity gaps, and I think that's something that some districts are really struggling with because we have some districts that are funded by property taxes. We have other districts that are primarily funded through state funding. So some schools just don't have a lot of money. How do you make sure that all schools, and I know this isn't a question just for you, obviously.
I know, it's a big issue.
Yeah, how do you make sure that all schools can do this?
And we're facing this right now with state debt that we have, and we were hoping for more federal stimulus money for schools. I know we are still advocating in Washington with congressional delegation on really to up those types of dollars. We need money for PPE and barriers and distancing and even more staff as school districts kind of reduce density in classrooms, spread kids out. That means they need more adults in the building. A continuing ongoing conversation.
Are there any unanswered questions that you think, and I know that this isn't really a state responsibility, but as we're going in, it's just a few days away. Are there anything that is unresolved? I
think you're seeing many school districts, delay a week or so as they have more professional development days. I think many school districts are still having conversations about things like contact tracing and testing. If we have a child, for instance, in kindergarten that has symptoms, what does that mean? If we have a child in second grade that actually has COVID, what does that mean? So I think that was a relatively recent development in the past few weeks where the school districts that you need to have real concrete contact tracing plans, real concrete testing plans. That doesn't mean school districts have to test children, on the contrary, but school districts have to know where they're going to send children. We're having still conversations with county departments of health on is there a way we can expedite children and faculty that are being tested. In some areas of the state we still have 7 to 14 days. Some people are waiting for test results. Here, I recently was COVID tested for a medical exam, and I had my test results back in 2 days. So is there kind of a way we can make that across the state norm? Can we get 12 hours results back for students? Can we get 24-hour results back for students? Those are the conversations I think that are still happening and will continue probably right up until we open school and onward.
What are you hearing from parents on that? Do they want to see their kids tested in going back to school, or is that kind of a rolling conversation that's happening everywhere?
Yeah, I think there's a split amongst parents and families. The one most important thing is that no family decision is wrong. Parents are making the decision whether they're going to send their child remote, whether they're going to send their child in person. That decision is unique to that family, and that decision must be supported no matter what they decide. There's conversations now about what happens, for instance, if a child who is in kindergarten has a fever. They may have an ear infection. Should we immediately send them to have COVID testing, or should they go to the pediatrician to see if it's an ear infection? So those are the type of conversations I think parents really want more information on, and I know us, the governor's office, our education partners and SED are still working on those issues.
When you're talking about those kids in kindergarten, I'm thinking about these 6, 7-year-olds that are being sent to school.
Yeah.
And as the PTA, what do you see as enforcement for these types of things?
I know.
It's these kids, they might not understand why they have to wear a mask.
I know.
How do we make sure that they're doing it?
I will tell you that children are resilient, and they've been wearing masks now when they go out with their parents for months. So they're used to it. The one thing that I can guarantee is that every kindergarten teacher, right through high school physics teacher, is going to make the best experience they can for those students. That's what they're there for. That's why they went into education. They went into education to make a difference. They're going to continue to make a difference. Are our school buildings going to look different? Yes, and that's okay right now, because the health and safety of our kids is paramount and is critical. But I think we're going to be okay.
And we will be watching. Kyle Belakapitsky from the state PTA, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having us on.
If you have a kid going back to school or have some insight on your local school district, we want to hear from you. Just head to our website at nynow.org and click the link to contact us at the top of the page. And follow us on social media at nynow_PBS. Until then, thanks for watching this week's New York Now. Have a great week and be well.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET.